Today we're going to talk about the Swiss housing market because many people say that finding an apartment in Switzerland is almost impossible. There are stories about hundreds of applicants, months of searching, and constant rejections everywhere on the internet. But the reality is a bit more nuanced. I actually went through this process myself when I moved to Switzerland, and once you understand how the system works, finding an apartment becomes much easier than most people expect. In this video, I will show you how the Swiss housing market really works, where you should actually search for apartments, what documents landlords expect, and what strategies can dramatically increase your chances of getting accepted. So before we get into the details, let's actually start with a bird's eye view on the Swiss housing market. Depending on where you're coming from and what you're used to, the Swiss housing market might seem much more competitive, especially in the big cities like Zurich and Geneva. But sometimes even outside the bigger centers, so if you live in the agglomeration areas, it can be really difficult because the country is relatively dense. It's not the most densely populated country. The Swiss always claim that. It's not true. The Netherlands is actually the most densely populated country in Europe. And Liechtenstein, for example, is also dense, but it is still one of the more densely populated countries in Europe and the world. And this means that it is a bit more difficult. So finding an apartment can actually take a couple of months. Especially if you don't know the system yet, right? So if you're new, you don't have all the documents in place yet, you maybe don't speak the local language, it can be really hard at first to get through all of this, especially in the centers, but also sometimes in the suburban areas. In the rural areas, it's typically quicker because there's less competition, but of course, this may not be a suitable solution for you. So in the dense cities, expect a couple of months. Sometimes it's faster, but it can take a couple of months until you found something good. Whereas in rural areas, by contrast, it's usually less than a month. And then, of course, if you already live in Switzerland, you have a work contract and everything in place, it makes it much easier. You know the system already a bit. You have all the documents that people will be asking for you. You don't have to explain to them why you're, for example, handing in your work permit like a couple of weeks later and so on. And then, of course, the type of accommodation that you're looking for, it does make a big difference. So the easiest is if you're single or you're just moving alone at first and maybe your family will join you in a couple of months and you're just looking for a room for a while, be it more like a furnished business apartment or a room in a flat share. This is often easier because you're not dealing with like a typical administration that has like a bigger process, but you might be dealing with just somebody who's gone for 6 months and they really want to fill that room so they don't have to pay the rent on their own. So it might be easier for you. And of course, there's less constraints, right? So if in contrast, you're looking for a family apartment for 2 kids with like 4 rooms and something, you might need to be close to really good daycare options or other factors for your family. This limits your choices, kind of your attractiveness to administrations, because of course they look for like the lowest risk. Where can you actually find apartments in Switzerland? You might have already noticed there's a couple of big platforms like HomeGate, ImmoScout24, Comparis, and then on top of that, there's some more smaller specialized platforms. There's Flatfox, for example. There's platforms for the French-speaking part. I'm certain also for the Italian-speaking part. You can look into all of these. It is a bit time-consuming. That's kind of the downside, and you might see some multiples, some duplicates, but that's just how it is. On top of that, there's, of course, Facebook groups. I'm not the biggest fan of Facebook groups because you never really know if it's a scammer, whereas technically on big platforms, you can also not be 100% sure, but it's a bit more difficult usually. And yeah, but you can definitely look into it. It's just not so transparent because, you know, you look into all these platforms, then you don't see it on a map. So be careful with Facebook groups. I think it's not the most efficient way to look for houses actually. And then there's administrations, companies who, you know, manage the buildings. They often also post stuff on their website. But actually more interesting is probably direct networking, meaning if you have any friends, colleagues, local contacts, and you ask them or they come to you, it can be much better because very often somebody needs to move fast because they've already found something new and then it's like mid-month, so they want to get out of their old contract as fast as possible. So they're looking for somebody to take over their contract, or they, you know, are just gone for a couple of months and want to rent out their apartment to somebody so they don't have to pay the rents themselves. This can really help because it can sometimes shortcut the process, especially if you already know the person, then your chances of getting it are much higher. If none of that works for you, there's sort of the default way that especially corporations usually go for. If you work for big tech, they will often sponsor you a business apartment or go through some relocation agency that also can get you an apartment for 2-3 months until you find something more permanent. Or of course, they can also help you find something permanent in the longer run. The most efficient, but of course also the most expensive way. It can really make sense though. Like if you have a high salary, if you're a specialist, a manager, it can actually make sense because being new to a country, not really working how all these processes work, it can be really time consuming and you can make some mistakes. So depending on your salary, it might actually be a really good investment to go this route. But of course, if in contrast, if you're a student, it typically doesn't make sense because your time, your salary per hour is simply not that high. So obviously doing the work yourself is a better idea in this case. By the way, if you're currently planning your move to Switzerland and want help with the apartment search, feel free to check the link in the description below. Now, we've understood the basics. Now we should look into the documents you're going to need ready when you apply for apartments, typically after your viewing. The first thing is obviously the application form. It could be anything from a paper form, a Word document, a PDF, or some web application that you just fill out. Then the second thing is a debt registry extract, which should basically be empty. Normally it just shows if you ever didn't pay your bills on time. This should really be empty. If it's not, then it's not good. It significantly reduces your chances. Important to know also here is they might ask for something similar, like a credit score or so from the countries you previously lived in, just to see if you were paying your bills on time in that previous country. Because obviously if you move to Switzerland, then you could apply for a debt registry extract typically, but it will always be empty and it's not really telling them anything if you've only been a resident for like 1 month or something in some flat share. Then of course a proof of income. It could be an employment contract. It could be 3 pay slips from the last months. It could be invoices if you're a freelancer. It's basically relevant for 2 reasons. A, is your income stable enough? And B, also is your income high enough so you can actually afford this place? We'll come to that later in a few minutes because there's rules around how high your income needs to be so that you can afford a certain apartment. Then of course you need a passport and residence permit copy if you already have it. The first apartment you will apply for, you have to hand in that residence permit later because you can only get it later. But then of course the second, third time when you move again, you should immediately submit it because you already have your residence permit. Finally, something that is technically not legally required, but you should really have it, personal liability insurance. They might ask for it. They will not always ask for it, but definitely need to have it and should also be able to show it if they ask for it. So now we're ready to talk about the whole process. We already talked about the documents you need ready, but first you have to start with the actual viewing. And this is really interesting because you might think it's just for you, but it is not. It's actually also for the other side. Treat an apartment viewing like a job interview, kind of, right? So there might be a previewing on a video call in some cases, but this is usually only done if either it's more like a flat share and somebody's renting out something temporarily and you're maybe not in the country yet, or if it's in a rural area where there's not so much demand, so they actually need to work a bit to get the apartment filled. But very often there's no pre-physical step. You actually have to go there. Why is this so important? Not only so that you see it and understand what the neighborhood looks like, what maybe the entrance is like, if it's comfortable for children and so on, but it's also for them because they want to see how do you behave. It can pay off to dress up professionally at least. So they want to see what type of a person are you. Depending on the number of applicants, it can actually make a distinction. They might actually remember you positively or not. And if they don't, it's not so good actually. It's good to leave a good impression. It will definitely improve your chances. And then the second step is submission, and typically you have to be fast, especially in competitive markets. So in Zurich and Geneva, for example, you should typically submit all your documents within a couple of hours, or I would say maximum 24 hours, which is why it's so important to have the stuff already ready, because otherwise chances are you're just not going to get the apartment because somebody, they already have enough applications after a few hours, and then they just say, okay, we'll just sort of close the pipeline. Next up, they're going to look at your documents and all your data. They will look for red flags. Red flags are typically if your income is unclear or if they think you will play like the trumpet every Sunday morning or something like this. It could also be sometimes when they feel like you're not a good fit culturally for the house. And of course, also very important, pets. Always look at whether they accept pets in the advertisement. They will typically write it in the advertisement. They will typically say they will not accept pets. So typically it's a waste of time to even look at apartments or places where they say they won't accept pets. It's highly unlikely that they have no other applicants without pets and that they will permit it. Apartments exist where it is permitted. you might have to go for more rural areas in this case. Next up comes a decision. So very often you will get a decision within a couple of days. It really pays off to ask. If not, just to see if the process is still going, if maybe something's missing in your process. I would say after a maximum of 14 days, if you don't get an answer, then it's just a no, and you might often not get an answer at all, similar to how job application processes work. If they actually accept you, then you should quickly wire the security deposit. The official process is there's a separate bank account for this, which is like an escrow account kind of, where you pay that in and it's just held there. And there's also certain rules on how the landlord can access that deposit money. In many cases, if you just rent a room, you will often just wire a deposit to your intermediary landlord directly for anything, just a room or something temporary. That's often the case. In rare cases, you might also see actually cash payments, but this is not the official way how it's done. So the official way is actually to go through an escrow account. There's a certain type of account in Switzerland, which is usually free and offered by almost all banks to do that. And it's typically around 2 to 3 months of rent. So really be aware of that. It might be a lot of money for you, especially if you come from a country with lower salaries. This can be a lot of liquidity that you're losing before moving into your first apartment. Let's talk numbers a bit. You might really say that, oh, Switzerland is so expensive, especially Zurich. And this is kind of true. But then you also have to see it in relation to other cities. Like if you compare Zurich to New York or London or Singapore, I think these will be appropriate cities to compare it to. Then you will find that the rental prices are actually similar, or they may even be lower. And more importantly, if you compare it to your net income, sometimes it doesn't actually look that bad. So for example, I often hear people paying like 30 to 50% in some other European cities of their net income, which is really a lot. And in Switzerland, it's not even possible. Like they wouldn't even accept you if your net income is that low. Maximum a third of your income can be the rent and not more. As a software engineer, for example, if you have a net salary of around 8,000 to 10,000 K per month, maybe also in combination with your partner if both of you work, and you pay 2,000 to 3,000 Swiss francs in rent, that's around 20 to 30%, which, it's still quite a bit, but it can often actually be less than in some other European countries. And if you see it this way, then arguably the rent prices are often actually not that bad. And I would say like a net income of 10,000 Swiss francs per month as a household income, it is actually achievable. It is not the average income. It's for Swiss standards, it's still a high income. Don't forget about that. But as a software engineer, you typically have a relatively high income, even for Swiss standards. So let's look at some ballpark prices. And now it's 2026, so this keeps changing all the time. But in Zurich, for example, if you're a single or you're moving alone for now, then one-bedroom apartment studios, they're somewhere in the ballpark of, I would say, 1,400 to 2,500, depending on how the exact location is, if it's more like in the city center or more like in the suburbs. So actually outside of the city of Zurich. Whereas a family apartment, I would say it's ballpark 3,000. Again, depending very much on, are you in the city center? Do you have a view over the Zurich Lake? Then it's probably more. Then it's probably more like 4,000 or 5,000 or something. You can actually spend, 10,000 per month for a big apartment with many rooms and lake view and all this stuff. But you can definitely find something around 3,000, especially if you go a bit outside of the centers. And then if you look at Geneva, interestingly, Geneva is actually more expensive usually, which I find interesting because taxes are also higher in Geneva, and it's not even the big tech market. Like all the big tech jobs, they're more in Zurich and surroundings. But in this sense, it's actually good. So Zurich is actually slightly cheaper. The smaller cities and especially rural areas, so cities like Basel, it's a bit less expensive, or especially Lausanne and Bern, they're less expensive. They have quite some students and they're just not these big tech hubs. So that makes a difference. But keep in mind that taxes there are higher. So you actually have to do the calculation of rent plus taxes, because you don't win anything if you live in a city where the rent is lower but the tax is higher, right? So you should really look into living outside of the centers, because especially if you can work remotely a lot of the time, and if maybe you need to show up in the office only once a week or once a month, then this can really make a difference. Because if you only have to be there once a month, it can actually make sense to travel across Switzerland, since trains are so good, and spend a lot of money on rent and often also taxes, because some of the rural areas have lower taxes as well. Really look into this. It's something counterintuitive. I see so many people saying, oh, my job is in Zurich, so I need to live in Zurich. This thinking isn't entirely wrong, but it's also in many cases a waste of money, because I think agglomeration areas and rural areas, they can be a really, really good deal, especially in the south of Switzerland, Vallis and Ticino and Graubünden. They have some really good opportunities. The markets there are easier and less competitive. So as you can see, finding an apartment in Switzerland is definitely competitive. But if you understand the system, prepare the right documents, and know where to search, the process becomes much easier. But housing is only part of the bigger picture. Many people move to Switzerland because of the high salaries, the safety, and the quality of life. But surprisingly, a lot of newcomers leave again after just 12 to 18 months. Not because of money, but because the lifestyle, the pace of life, and the cultural expectations are very different from what they expected. In my next video, I will break down who actually thrives in Switzerland and who struggles after moving there, especially for software engineers, high performers, and people planning a long-term relocation. So if you're seriously thinking about moving to Switzerland, make sure to watch that video now. See you there.